are all the new members. So today's meeting, let me share my screen.
Also, really quickly, do you mind if I add? So for the new folks, Carlos and Yolanda are the co-leads for this group, this work group. Yolanda, I'm about to give you sharing access in case you need it. So sorry for the delay. Okay, thanks, Carlos. Just give some context for folks.
Okay. Okay, perfect. Thank you for that. I always sometimes forget that. So let's see. I'm sharing the wrong one. I mean.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, okay. I don't know why my computer is acting up. I'm sorry, everybody.
Okay.
Can everybody see my screen?
Yeah, it's your screensaver or
my screensaver. Oh my gosh.
Yeah,
okay.
that's all I see.
Okay.
Or the background, whatever it's called. There now. Yeah, your
Okay,
PowerPoint.
Perfect. So really quick, we're going to keep talking about data modeling. And today's walkthrough is going to correlate to the dashboard in a day, lab 1 and 2. We're going to review about the outcomes, results in Power BI, give sense and naming conventions and what each column means. We're going to do some data cleanup, separate and merging columns, create dimensions and fact tables. We're going to talk about the star schema, and there's some things to consider going forward regarding the assessment, like I said, the naming convention, group assessment, and things like that. So without further ado, let's go to Power BI. So whenever you guys open Power BI, you can get data in different ways. Most of the time, if you are working with OneDrive, I'll rather get the data, the downloaded data through their OneDrive. Because if you, for security purposes, as well as ease of update. Because if you're using different folders in your OneDrive and you change computers or you change locations of the folder, it may not always pull the right data. And by the way, small disclaimer, the way that I'm going to explain how to pull the data in Power BI, I'm going to do it, download it, very similar to what Jackie has done and the video that Michelle sent it to all of y'all. There are different ways to do it from the API or Fabric or Azure. There's many different tools, but right now I'm just using the basics. So if you go to your OneDrive online, and locate where your file lives. So in this case, I'm going to go to my projects. And usually whenever you download the file directly from Canvas, it will give you all the information and when was it downloaded. So just click on it. And what we're going to do is we're going to share the location, the web link. So we're going to go to Power BI. We're going to go get data from the web. And we're going to remove everything up to the file, okay, the file name. And you're going to give access, sign in. Especially talking about security, and that's another reason why I rather do it through this method than actually looking at, for example, my OneDrive, where is the location of my OneDrive and all the information. Because if your computer, somebody gets stolen or anything like that, it's easier to get it from your OneDrive here than in the cloud. You can also disconnect it, but you never know. So it's always better to connect it directly and create a loop.
Carlos, can I ask a question? We already got a
Sure.
question. Sorry. And it's about compatibility with Mac. So is Power BI only compatible through Windows, if you know?
Actually, Windows does not have a Power BI desktop.
Okay, are you using a Mac? No.
No, I'm using right today. I'm using my laptop. That's why I'm having a little difficulty because I connected to my laptop.
Okay.
So usually I have a Mac. Once you upload a report to the cloud, you can make basic changes into the report, but you have to use the desktop.
Okay, so you usually use a Mac with a Mac OS system, and you're able to upload.
No, you have to use a PC.
Oh, you do have to. Okay.
Yeah, Power BI desktop is only available for PC. It does not have a Mac compatibility.
Okay. Okay.
So you can do, once you upload a report into the server, which I'll try to show you guys today, you can make some changes in the server online, but you have to use the Power BI desktop to be able to upload that information.
Okay. Okay. If that didn't answer the question for the person, please chime in. Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks.
Thank you so much for checking on the.
Yeah, I'll watch the chat. Yeah, no worries.
Anybody else, just interrupt me, jump in, and I have no problem with that as well.
Thank you.
So click on transform the data. So let's go over, before I change any names or anything like that, let's go over what all of these columns name mean. Because sometimes it's a data dump and sometimes it's hard to understand what these come from. So this schema, this report that Canvas puts for us whenever we go into the reporting and downloading it setting, it pulls from a lot of different tables. So it has a student name, student ID, and the student ID, depending on how your institution is set up. It could be the student actual ID, or it could be a made up ID to be able to connect Canvas with your internal system. In our university, we use PeopleSoft, and we don't give the students ID. And actually, this is all sample data, so I have took all of the information out of the students' names and information. A student sys ID, again, is the system that is connected. Then assessment title, that's the title given in Canvas. So whenever a faculty gives the name of the assignment, that's the title that is we're pulling down. The ID of that, the assessment type, it could be a quiz, an assignment, all of those ways to assess students, it will show here. The submission date, if the faculty has a submission date in the assignment, it will show there. If it's a paper, it will not show there, only if it's online uploaded. The submission score, again, the rubrics could be used for assessment and grading. In our university, in my college, we only use it for assessment unless they are embedded inside a bigger, larger grading rubric. So faculty can use a different score, a different grade, and a score for assessment purposes. Here's the name of the learning outcome given. And my suggestion is to be careful with your naming convention, because the rubric and the outcomes, the rubrics are created for many different outcomes. For Canvas, they call it outcomes, what we will consider a rubric dimension. So be careful on naming them and making them easier to identify with faculty, because if not, it's going to make a bigger mess once you clean up the data, as well as putting together the rubrics later on. So I will suggest to always put the name of the group first, and then the location of the rubric. So for example, SO1.1, 0.2, 0.3, etc. And I think we have a question. Yes, this is the raw data generated, exactly. This is the report downloaded, the same way that Jackie did it in our first show and tell.
And just to add on to what Carlos was mentioning with the naming conventions, it's a good idea also to create like a dictionary that identifies what each category means, especially with your learning outcomes, so that any faculty that are entering in the outcomes or creating their questions to link to the outcomes, that they're using a consistent system to make it easier for you to do any type of analysis that you would need to do with it.
Exactly. Thank you so much. Always have metrics created for everything. Naming conventions, the courses as well, collection cycle, all of that is always very helpful for you and your faculty to identify. Then the learning outcome ID, you can upload the outcome in Canvas when you created the Canvas, or you can actually create it in there. So that's the ID number. The numbers of attendance, the outcome score. In this specific set of data, it's a Likert scale from 1 to 5. It's a very holistic type of rubric without zeros, or also no partial grading. These two new columns were added last summer. Now we can connect the question banks to sub-account level outcomes. So that right now, none of them will have a question. It's only going to be assignments, so that you will not be able to see, they will not have anything. It's just rubrics. Here are the course name, and this is something that each institution is different. In our institution, the section name, like for example, civil engineering, electrical engineering, then the number, in parentheses is the year and the semester and the section. But the course name in Canvas, a course can be a compendium of multiple sections. So a online section, for example, can be taught or presented in Canvas along with a face-to-face. So the course name is all of that. So if I pick here to see all of the names, sometimes you have 001 or 040, like I mentioned, the online or Zoom, or multiple sessions of Zoom, or multiple face-to-face classes. So depending on how the faculty or your administrator, the Canvas administrator has set up, that's how it's going to present. And this is what's called cross-listing. So that's something that you have to consider, is knowing the naming convention and if your institution is cross-listing or not.
So Carlos, that means same faculty member teaching all those sections, right?
Exactly.
Okay. And then we have another question in the chat, if you don't mind. I hope I
Sure.
found you at a good spot. So Chad noticed that there were some students' results that seemed to be duplicated in the CSV file, but without an entry in the student sys column. And I was wondering why maybe that's happening.
Because it could be that, like, for example, in this section, like here, complexity has the same score. It could be for, sometimes there's duplication, and sometimes it could have happened is that it's different semesters. Let me see if it's by student. Yeah. So sometimes there's duplication. I'm going to be honest with you all. I create this really quickly, so it may be duplication if not. But the good thing is that you can always remove the duplicates, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute.
Patty
But
made
no,
a good point that
always
maybe the student submitted more than once, because you know how sometimes you can maybe resubmit and then it'll pull
Yes.
them multiple maybe times
And it
too.
tells you the attempt here, so it
Oh,
should be
attempt, great.
a 1, 2, or 3 attempts.
Okay. Okay.
So for
So then,
example, here has the complexity. So yeah, this one is
duplicate.
duplicated.
Okay. Oh, it looked like one was scored and one wasn't, right? I saw that null and 100. Yeah, is that the score column? One more left to the left. Oh,
Let me see. Yes.
maybe that's submission score.
Take
Yes.
a look at the learning outcomes. I believe they're also measuring different learning outcomes. So the
Ah.
one assignment could be measuring 4 different learning outcomes.
Exactly, that too.
Well,
Actually,
not in this case.
in my case, it's duplicating all the outcomes for the same students, but it's not duplicating all students, just some students. But it's
Interesting.
duplicating all the results by those students. I know they are duplications because they lack a student SIS entry. Otherwise, they are exactly the same.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. But nobody has any clues about why that might happen. Carlos Yolanda. Shoot. Okay.
Depending on it could be a number of things. It could be in the side of the faculty, or it could be a Canvas issue. I have only had one time on duplication, and it was because of faculty added a rubric to an assignment, scored it, and added the same assignment rubric to a similar naming assignment, and then completed the whole entire assignment. So sometimes you have to play Sherlock Holmes, and Canvas, customer service will be able to help you with that. I don't have any answer because why you having all duplication. Were you able to download the report on from Canvas, or did you pull it from API?
I was able to download the report from Canvas. It's CSV files, so I go through and clean the files from the duplications from the files, but they are not different assignments, and it's the same faculty, same course, same assignment, same student, same outcomes.
Did Canvas give you any like reason why?
No, I also cannot filter results by outcome. It's an issue in Canvas they don't seem to be working to fix.
Gotcha.
Patty's mentioning also that it could be at the institution level, that like maybe if the admin has student in the course in different ways, like the way they enrolled them, you're saying, Patty, probably?
Yeah, I wondered if there's institutional settings that may be affecting that
Yeah.
as well. I was just curious if anyone
Yeah.
else had encountered that.
Okay, thanks
Yeah,
for
'cause
that.
sometimes the institutions, like, if, I don't know if your institution has an institution email address, and then maybe the student's a personal email address, how did they register? There's lots of little weird factors where I've seen, students sometimes come out twice with different information. So I don't know.
Right, thank you, great question, because these are the real world challenges we encounter when we dig in and start working on these things, which is why we were hoping everyone would start getting their hands dirty and try it out, because yeah, it's complicated, but okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for these questions. I'll try to dig more information about that and give you some answers. But also, I will be a good idea to talk to your administrator and campus. They'll be able to like finding out the problem. Like Patty mentioned, it could be for the authentication and how they are authenticating the students. So going forward, the other information that I want to bring out to you all is this section SysID. The section information system, that's where the cross-listing, you'll know which course for each are in there. So instead of using most of the time, if I know in my college, we have a lot of cross-listing, I no longer use the course name. I start using the section SysID, because that's when I know that different courses are using the same, two sections of different course could be in the same course name. So if I want to separate the information, I use the course SysID. One thing that we do in our institution, and let me pause the.
Do you want me to pause the recording?
Yes, please.
Okay,
So it's always better to use the section SysID to be able to use the cross-listing courses and be able to recognize and parse which ones are which. So, and then the assignment URL, that gives a specific click on where the assignment lives. The outcome-friendly name, in my case, I did not add any outcome-friendly name. The points possible, like I said, is a 5 Likert scale. The mastery score for us is a 3. It could be for master's level, for example, a 4. So depending on how the rubric is set up, and here it gives you the master, and it's another way for later on, if you want to show it in Power BI and do those calculations, you can calculate how many students master it by 1 or 0. The learning outcome rating, in this case, we did from superior to unsatisfactory, so it gives you that granularity. The rating point is the same thing as the outcome score. Account ID, that's the sub-account ID, and the account name. So in our college, each department is divided in their own sub-accounts. So we have chemical engineering, civil engineering, electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, and electrical. Yeah, so all depending on where the course is taught, that's connected to a specific account name. So if it will help you for, like, let's say, road security or showing the title, anything like that, that's also very helpful to know. But that's pretty much all of what the columns mean. Any questions so far? Perfect. So let's keep going. So let's do some data modeling. And I always like to change the names of everything, because in case I have to go back and make any changes, I'll remember exactly what I did. So in this case, I will call it fact outcomes, scores, or results. And one thing about Canvas is that depending on your institution, if they're in Canvas 1 or 2, you can download all of the semesters, all of the terms, or you can only download one term at a time. In this case, before the transition to Canvas 2, I was able to download all of the semesters. But now that we are transitioning Canvas 2, I can only download one specific semester at a time. With an API, you can download as many, a time frame or anything like that.
And what again is an API? Sorry. For folks who might be watching also later in the future.
Thank you. It's a way to connect Canvas information and be able to download information in a SQL way. So instead of going through the Canvas themselves and reporting in the settings, then report, they can download directly to the tables.
Okay, great, thank you.
So let's make some basic data modeling. You can use DAX, which is the formula for Power BI. You can create new tables, anything like that. I'm just going to do this the very simple way. And I'm going to, for example, first of all, let's go back a little bit. Let's remove the duplicates. And the way to remove the duplicates, you can click on course name and the student name or student ID, and then go and remove your duplicates.
Don't you need to care about assignment? In case there's more
That
than one
too. Thank you
assignment?
so much. Yes. Lost. Sorry, guys.
And do you allow multiple submissions?
For us, we don't, because we're using the assessment of the I call this. We're using one, not for grading, but for assessment. But if they're using for multiple for grading as well, then definitely the submission number will also, the attempt will also look into it. So let's do that as well. So now we have removed the duplicates according to student ID, the assessment title, and the attempts. So now we don't have any more duplicates. Now we're going to, I usually for the fact table, the facts table usually is the table that contains all the information. And most of the time, all the facts table are horizontal rather than vertical. I like to keep the original data and just duplicate. So I'm going to duplicate the column. And I'm going to extract only the names by the delimiter. So I'm going to split by the delimiter, custom, and it's going to be the dash that we have. So it went from this complex number to having one column at a time. So to pull out the section, just merge these two. And depending on how your institution does things, usually our institution doesn't have any comma or anything like that. It's just a space. And we're going to change the name of the column to term. Now, to further review the information and to be able to get the accurate section number, because if you hear some, depending on how your institution does things, if they're cross-listing, you see here, we have every course has its section. So we don't need to separate the section, the 001, out of the name. But if they were cross-listing, if you were doing from the course, you will have to separate the section. But in this case, I'm not going to do that. So I'm just going to merge these two to have the whole entire name of the class. And I'm going to call it course. Sorry, I did incorrectly. And the apply steps is always great to, if you have multiple things, like if you create multiple space of the same thing, is always a good idea to name them as well. And the reason why in this case it showed up weird is because you have to click first the column that you want first and then the second one with control. Then merge the columns, then space, and that's the course column. So here's pretty much all the cleanup that I need to do. Is there any other things that you guys usually do in your cleanup stage? Nope. Perfect. So now I'm going to start creating dimensions to be able to create my star schema. And dimensions are like the keys for your data. So you can have a dimension table of all of the assignment titles, or a dimension for the learning outcomes, or the courses, or the terms, and things like that. So I don't have to work twice. I always reference and not duplicate it. Duplicate means that it copies the stage that you have the information. If you reference, means that anything that changes in this original table, it will go into here. So again, if you're looking at updating this in the future and it's not one off, it's always always better to do that. So you can always, if it gets another class added, another outcome, you always have it there without adding manually to do it. So we're gonna choose the columns, and like I said, I'm gonna the dimension for term. So I'm just gonna look at the term column that I did. And then I'm gonna remove the duplicates. So there is a null, a space one. And again, that could happen in this case because I downloaded everything. So I had a sandbox course. So I can remove that information here. And you also sometimes you have to look at why you have spaces. And that will tell you what you have done, what steps you have done are not correct with all the data. And it's looking that why is not.
Was it because of those parentheses around file 2020? I don't know. I don't remember if I saw that on the other ones. When you were scrolled over to the left, I noticed in the complicated course it had.
Yeah.
Did the
and
others
I
have?
did that already. So it should be.
Yeah.
Sometimes this, let's see. You can also move filtered columns. Let's see. Yeah, so for example, in this case, for some reason, they're not section C's ID. And that is a issue with my administrator. So what we'll have to do is remove this. And to mitigate that problem, and one thing that we'll have to use the course name and then merge the information. Let's back up a little bit, and this is a first time I see this issue on this data set. I have not had any problems before. So what I'm gonna do right now, I'm gonna contact my administrator and see why there's no CIS ID, but I'm gonna use the course for this. I'm gonna use the course for this for our show and tell today. Actually, we still have running out of time. So let me just use what I have and remove the spaces. And then I can create a table that I know that there's issues with that.
Right, so you could either figure out a workaround, you go to the source to fix it, or let's say you're in a rush, you say, okay, other folks need this stuff into a dashboard, so I'm gonna make the note that says this course or this section or whatever is missing, but I'm gonna build the rest, that kind of thing, right?
Exactly.
Okay, yep.
Exactly.
Being pragmatic, but you still have to go at some point and solve it for the bigger and the longer term matter.
Yes.
Thanks.
So we're gonna call it dimension term. And we're gonna reference again fact course issue. So I'm just gonna pull the ones that have the term blank. So now these ones are the ones that we have issues with. Now, I'm gonna create a course dimension. From the list of courses that I created. And then remove the duplicates. And here are all the courses. And again, because we have issues, we're just going to remove the blank ones. Okay. Also, let's do another for learning outcomes.
Carlos, did that one need to be renamed? Because you made the one D term. Was that supposed to
Sorry,
be?
yes,
Okay.
should be D instead of fact. Yeah, sorry. This is fact and this is a D. And we're gonna choose just the outcomes. And remove the duplicates. And you see in here, I have some retire learning outcomes, and that's another suggestion that I'll give you guys is to create a folder that's called retire, and then anytime that the learning outcome gets retired or is no longer being used or changed, to name that so faculty will know that those learning outcomes are no longer in use. Because once you have an outcome created and there's data in it, you can no longer delete it. So that's pretty much all the data modeling I'm going to create for today. There's now more information that I want out of this. So I'll just close and load.
What does that mean, load here? Like-
That's loading into the model, and there's some errors here. I'm going to see what errors do I have. So what happened is that whenever we make all the data modeling and make all the transformation, the Power BI means is loading into this the new changes that we have created into the model.
Great, thanks.
So let's see the errors.
And just for those who may not be familiar with Power BI, you can see towards the top of the columns where the different colors are. And that, so you can see where the green little bar is. And then the red and then the gray. That will help give you an idea of where to look for any of the errors. So you can use that as a guide as you're going through the columns.
And the reason
Thank you.
why,
I didn't notice
so
that.
thank you so much, Yolanda. You are completely right. And it's always helpful to have this available open. Sometimes you just have to hover over. The reason why it's giving an error is because once you download the data and transform it, automatically Power BI will choose the type of data that each column has. Some has just, text, number. In this case, because the majority of the data was numeric, it gave me the numeric value. However, there are some text in it. So that's why it gave me the error. So I'm just gonna go to delete this. And in the facts, I'm gonna go to the column that has the error and just change it to a text. And I still have errors. Oh, that's not the outcome. I'm sorry. That's the result. Let's see. Why is it giving me the error? Still showing me that. Let's see. Mm. So the workaround that we can do in this section name, because it has a lab, our institution has courses that are embedded labs, for example. So what we can do is, so we changing the tab on the top will fix the issue. If not, I can split the
I think it's okay if you can't figure it out right now, because this is just such a perfect demonstration of real world. Like we all encounter this stuff all the time. And sometimes it takes a bit digging down the rabbit hole to figure it out, right?
Yes, definitely.
And since, we do just 4 more minutes, and I just, if you feel like this is an okay place to stop with to be continued.
Yes, let me see if it works in here. If not,
Okay.
I'll get a free admin step. No, that's a perfect place to stop. We'll continue when I fix that next time.